Good morning, everyone. We're going to discuss on the environmental movement, and in continuation to our last class on what environmentalism is all about and the various facets and issues which were covered in the issues when we talked about in environmentalism and the various trends. And today in this class we will be primarily looking at the the environmental movement, particularly how American environmentalism or the northern environmentalism emerges, and what are the particular changes which evolve successively in the different eras, and what was the main thrust or important issues which were covered in the first wave of environmentalism, particularly conservation and preservation were one of the main issues which were being discussed or covered in the first era. Now, if you look in the slide where I quote from William Cronon, now far from being that one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, nature is quite profoundly a human creation. Indeed, the creation of very particular human cultures at very particular moments in history. And it further continues that it is not a pristine sanctuary. Instead, it is a product of that civilization and could hardly be contaminated by the very stuff it is made. Now, straight away to what happens in the West, primarily in America before the 60s and 70s. Now, American environmentalism, of course, occupies an important space when we locate the environmental movement, and the American environmental narratives usually begins with the idea of wilderness or wilderness thinking. And now wilderness in the West, and particularly in America, landscapes are being encountered as a process of that colonizations, and there has been this process of urbanization and industrialization, and by the period of 1870s, resource exploitation happens to dominate the development patterns in the West, and natural resources were such as engaging in mining, overgrazing, timber cutting, and monocrop plantations, and of course the issues of land and water rights were some of the undercurrents or the issues which have cropped up. Now, one of the primary concerns at that period of time was again the protections of America's natural resources, and many of the environmental organizations arose in support of the idea of conservation and preservations. Therefore, the philosophies of conservations and preservations happens to be one of the roots of American environmentalism, and which of course continue in some sense even till today. Now, conservation in some sense has occupied one of the important needs in American environmentalism, as I pointed out. And what does the idea of conservation talks about? The people who subscribe to this very ideas. So conservation groups emphasize the efficient use and development of physical resources to combat inefficient land management. And conservation is put forward the development strategy based on efficiency, scientific management, and centralized controlled and organized economic development. Now, many of you might be like familiar or might have heard about the very term called wasteland. Now, the efficient use and inefficient land management is where you tends to as a human we perceive a particular land as being useful or a particular resources as being inefficient. So therefore this very idea or notion of efficient management of land use and inefficient the binary between the two has in some sense been located. And the conservationists put forth a developmental strategy based on efficiency, scientific management, as I had pointed out. Yeah. Now, interestingly, this particular strategy was exemplified by the management systems which were created to emphasize the balance between the immediate and the long-term production which is necessary to sustain a continuous yield. Now, the conservationists established a foothold in the American politics way back in 1901 when the President Theodore Roosevelt delineated plans for the resource management and to the Congress. Now, conservation became the dominant resource strategy of the government during President Roosevelt's tenure, and which was illustrated and which can be seen from many of the policies of the government agencies. Now, further, there are regional and industry related interest groups which emerge as lobbying organizations and agency support groups. Now, secondly, if you look at what preservation is. Now, preservation in some sense occupied as one of the American frontier ideology and notions of the environment as defined in terms of wilderness. Now, what does the preservationist believed or advocate? The preservationists believed that wilderness preservation to be the imperiled by the forces of urbanization and industrialization, and they have the view that traditional conservation strategies of right use and efficient land management as promoting the industry needs. So the preservationist vision of nature was in some sense romanticized by poems of William Wordsworth and Henry David Thoreau, which analogize wilderness with religious sacredness. Now, I'm sure you must be aware about William Wordsworth's poem "The Daffodils," where the daffodils were in some sense being personified and being romanticized by the poet or the author in that particular poem. Now, preservation flowed easily from American frontier ideology and notions of the environment as defined in terms of wilderness. Now, if you look at the works of the John Muir, which of course I'll be discussing in a much more deeper detailed, and the works of, again, Aldo Leopold is important. Now, who is John Muir, and why is he occupying an important space when we talk about the wilderness movement or even the environmental movement? Now, John Muir is also known as John of Mountains because his love for nature and then the pristine nature, and also known for the father of national parks. He was an influenced Scottish American naturalist and environmental philosopher who advocate for the preservation of wilderness in the United States of America. And Muir was a founder and the first president of the Syria Club. He was also involved in establishing a number of parks, more importantly the Grand Canyon and the Kings Canyon. And in discussing the conservation history, it may be pointed out here that John Muir's night camping trip with President Roosevelt way back in 1903 could be considered to be one of a landmark and the most significant camping trip in environmental or conservation history. Now, according to Muir, if you look at his work, he goes on to argue that it was wrong to view the wilderness as simply resource for human consumption. Rather, wilderness had an independent value as a fountain of life, as a source of life. Moreover, the preservationist vision of nature was romanticized by the poems, as I had pointed out, like by William Wordsworth and so forth. Now, many environmental organizations that are considered mainstream today were formed way back in the late 1800s by the conservationists and preservationists who have that urge and desire to protect the natural environment and conserve the wildlife. Now, when considering the works of John Muir, according to Muir, these groups, that is the conservationists and preservationists, put forth complementary visions of preservations and right use of the wilderness resources by combating waste and spoilage associated with unregulated private development, and by suggesting or taking the help of science and technology would enhance the values of preservations and the necessity of wilderness. Now, while considering the American environmental movement, the origins of conservation and preservation, however, one has to be pretty much informed by the kind of awareness or the kind of class biases where there are divisions and certain kinds of stratifications among different populists. Now, if you further looked at the American wilderness historical perspective, now Americans have found it difficult to be indifferent to a factor so basic in their collective experience as the wilderness. Now, over the years, it has also been regarded both as enemy to the conquered in the name of civilization, and Christianity and progress as something of value to be cherished and preserved. Now, what remains of American wilderness is being weighed in the place of the public judgment, whether it is having a negative or maybe a positive impact. and part of this evaluation involve an assessment of the meaning of wilderness in American life, and which also demands to look at the way in which how the first form of colonialism, or how the first settlers arrived in the new world, that is with ideas of and intentions which are totally incompatible with the with appreciating wilderness. And then they have that, at the back of their mind, they have that notions of exploiting or appropriating nature. And these pioneers, in some sense, the first settlers, express their relation to wilderness with military metaphors. For example, the wild country was, an enemy to be conquered, subdued, or vanquished by a pioneer army. So therefore, that sort of attitudes or mindsets were pretty much embedded in the minds of the first settlers. So in their eyes, because this is a very critical way of looking at the wilderness, the American wilderness in a historical, if you locate in the historical perspective. So in their eyes, the only good tree was a dead one, which is not alive, a dead one in a fence, and or maybe a cabin wall or a fireplace. So such a basic utilitarian value system, which is perhaps advocated by John Muir, which regarded the trees as a pernicious waste. Now, I had also outlined that John Muir way back in 1892, and with some of his Californian friends, organized the Sharia Club for the purpose, and with the idea of preserving the forest and other features of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Now, Muir's way of thinking, that is, the forest reserve should be dedicated first and foremost to wilderness preservation, and his personal experience with lumber and grazing operations in the Sierras, in some sense, convinced him that even managed or scientific forestry was incompatible with the higher use of wilderness. Now, occasionally, Muir was revealed a realistic appreciations of his country's need for forest products, but at the same time, he also felt that there was already enough forest land in productive use. So consequently, Muir believed that government protection should be thrown around every wild grove and forest on the mountains, which still remained. So this position was in some sense consistent with Muir's philosophy, which stressed the non-utilitarian values of wilderness. Now, as I had pointed out, with some of his Californian friends, John Muir has organized and established the Sharia Club, and what they tried to looked at or made focuses was that they have great impetus and desire to conserve or preserve the nature in its pristine form. Now, as I had also pointed out that John Muir was pretty much enthusiastic in terms of establishing the national parks, and where nature has to be protected and then animals has to be protected. So the very idea of this wilderness thinking led to the emergence of, like the national parks, and many of the environmentalists, today are, very much critical about this idea of national parks, and the inception of these ideas of, barricading and isolating nature, or maybe in some sense reserving for some others. So therefore the national parks at some point of time are seen to be or viewed in a different way. So one can also in some sense give a critique and then make a statement that consequently the very idea of, early environmentalism, for example, the wilderness thinking or wilderness idea, which was posited by, the conservationists and preservationists, was not a social movement, but rather an attempt to by the privileged class to preserve a place for outdoor recreations like picnic, and then maybe, for some other, an expose or a kind of a holidaying for those the urban dwellers. So therefore one can in fact look at the kind of, changes or the kind of ideas which were embedded in the early environmentalism. So nextly we'll look at the works of Aldo Leopold, who has been one of the, again another influential thinker or the wilderness thinker since Muir. Now Aldo's work in his particular book, Ascent Country Almanac, which was published way back in 1949, is a very much celebrated book, and it is a combination of, the natural history, scenic painting in with words and philosophy. It is perhaps best known for the following quote particularly, which defines his land ethic. So what one of the main theses of, Aldo Leopold's work was that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability and beauty of the biotic community. Right? Now one can perhaps further go on with Leopold's, ideas, which was posited way back in the early 1920s. Now Aldo Leopold, was also an advocate, or he advocated the wilderness preservation in the national forest, and he was a brilliant, conservation philosopher, and he also made a classic statement of the problem. Now apart from the one which I have highlighted in the slide, I'll read out a portion of a classic statement which is given by Aldo Leopold. Now what he says was, there is little question that many of the attributes most distinctive of America and Americans are the impress, that is to impress the impress of wilderness and the life that accompanied it. So if we have such a thing as an American culture, and I think we have, its distinguishing marks are distinctive characteristic of successful pioneers. So these, if anything, are the indigenous part of our Americanism, the qualities that set it apart as a new rather than an imitative contributive of civilization. Is it not a bit beside the point for us to be solicitous about preserving those institutions without giving so much as a thought of preserving the environment which produce them, which may now be one of our effective means of keeping them alive. Now, Leopold's basic comments and arguments in some sense embrace opponents of wilderness, because to deny the value of wild country was to gainsay, sacred Americans' virtues. Now, as I had pointed out, Aldo Leopold was, not just a philosopher or a conservationist or environmentalist. Rather, Leopold was influential in the development of modern environmental ethics, maybe particularly in the movement for wilderness conservation. So his ethics of nature and wildlife preservation had a profound impact on the environmental movement, with his ecocentric or holistic ethics regarding land. And he also emphasized biodiversity and ecology, and was also a founder of science, the science of wildlife management. Now, if you looked at the way in which how Leopold tries to make a very holistic relationship or holistic understanding of human and nature. So he sort of tries to do away with the kind of binaries that human have with nature. So therefore, in this particular statement in his work, The Conservation Ethic, he tries to espouse the very idea of a harmonious relation to land, which is more intricate and more consequence to civilization than most of the historians of its progress seem to realize. So, according to him, civilization is not, as they often assumed, the enslavement of a stable and consistent art. It is a state of mutual interdependent cooperation between human animals and other animals, plants and soil, which may be disrupted at any moment by the failure of any of them. So therefore, he gives much emphasis on the way in which how the ecosystem functioned, and each unit plays an important and responsible part. So therefore, one can look at the way in which how a symbiotic relationship is being shared by humans and animals, or with animals and plants and soil, so on and so forth. Now again, in his biotic view of land, we could see that the emergence of ecology, that is the notion of understanding of how the species around us, including human, have been interrelated, and it has to be studied in that particular line and understanding. So the emergence of ecology has placed the economic biologists in a peculiar dilemma. So what is that dilemma? So with one hand, he points out the accumulated findings and of his search for utility or lack of utility of that particular species or something. Now, and with the other hand, he lifts the veil from biota, which is so complex, so conditioned by interwoven cooperations and competitions that no man can say where utility begins or ends. Now, one very important point over here to be made here, that is Aldo Leopold's book, that is Ancient Country Almanac. Now, what does Leopold tries to do in his particular book? Leopold uses his immediate surrounding as a jumping off point for a longer philosophical or historical tangents. He also writes about cutting down a tree, and he shows through its rings. He takes the reader on a journey back through time, that is looking at developments in the environment as well as environmental regulations. Now, throughout the almanac, in his particular book, he emphasizes the way in which people have become alienated, okay, from the natural world, as well as the ways in which intimate familiarities with one's environment is an important part of preserving the balance of the ecosystem upon which human life depends. So, the book in some sense is a series of loosely connected essays about humans' use of land, and in the particular section in country, he mediates on the distinction between the idea of land which can be owned or maybe which can be commoditized, and that which can be owned, and that of country which is the personality of the land and cannot be regulated or possessed by humans. For instance, in the particular sections, the Round River, Leopold describes his philosophy of conservation, and in the section wildlife in American culture, Leopold breaks down what he believes are the three most important ways people can interact with land, and the values they take from three interactions, that is the categories of values and experiences as a split rail values which connects people to their ancestors, who in turn were connected to the earth. Now, nextly, the man art experiences, which remind people of the importance of the natural world and sportsmanship, and which also encourages hunters and fishermen to hunt in a way that emphasize the quality of their skill, as opposed to focusing on the quantity of animals killed. Now, Leopold in his work put forth an extended argument for what he calls a land ethic, an ethical code for interacting with and caring for the land, that acknowledges that humans are not just living off the land, but are living with the land. So therefore there is this sort of connectedness and attachment or belongingness in his notion of understanding of land. Now, humans are also part of community that includes plants, animals, and the landscape, and Leopold argues that human needs to do a better job of respecting and caring for the natural world. Now, as we have been discussing how this idea of this wilderness has existed in America. Now, wilderness also in some sense offer man the challenge and of struggle and accomplishment, apart from the restraints of civilization that were often so frustrating and artificial. Now, some Americans began to realize what with Thoreau, and man paid a price for a surfeit and comfort and ease. So therefore, one can also see that the very nature in which how the works of Leopold, even though both of them, professed the very idea of this or promote this idea of wilderness, one could see the differences between the two. Now, on the one hand, John Muir display in abundance the siege-like mentality of the wilderness lover. And on the other, Leopold was hostile to any force or form that might disrupt or disturb the integrity of nature. Now, in the views of Leopold, human behavior that is even outside the national parks, one should be very much responsible. One should act responsibly, and perhaps outside the national parks, it is even more important than the protection of wild species within the enclosed, that is the national parks, for example. Now, rather, Leopold was pretty much urging those people to engage in mixed cropping that would enhance he being an experience in terms of forest management. So therefore he had urged people to inculcate this idea of mixed cropping, which would maintain the balance of soil fertility and which would rather could be able to maintain a balanced ecosystem, including the flora and fauna. Now, in one of the works or where I quote that when you keep on locating and discussing about America's earliest environmentalists. Now, O'Riordan described that America's earliest environmentalists as being voices in the wilderness, but ones of great scientific and intellectual ability who were warning against indiscriminate destruction of resources and calling for a reverence of nature. So therefore, on the one hand, with the use of like science and technology, nature was in some sense being tame and looked at. So therefore, one can also from the works further from the works of Aldo Leopold, one can see that he put the case of wilderness on an ethical plane and declaring that from wild country man could learn his dependency on the rest of the environment and the wisdom of replacing his arrogant attitude with one of humility and respect. So therefore, there has to be a mutual cooperation and understanding between human and the wild, or maybe with nature. So Leopold felt that contact with wilderness encourages the discard of the pioneer ethic of conquest and exploitation and the adoption of a new land ethic, that is, which made man aware that land and its innumerable life forms was a community to which he belonged and not a commodity which he possessed. So suffice to say that we could see the way in which how Leopold has put forth the very notions of understanding or how we should perceive land, and which is not something to be seen as a utility or a commodity, right? Now we have sort of like tries to foreground our notion of understanding of how the idea of this environmentalism had begun way back in the pre-1960s, in the later part of the 19th century, and how American wilderness ideas emerges or American environmentalism focuses on, and we had sort of like looked into how the conservationist and the preservationist in some sense has advocated, and from the works of John Muir and Aldo Leopold, we in some sense have an idea of how these wilderness ideas has emerged. Now the second era, that is the rise of modern environmentalism, as I had already discussed about the Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in one of the last in one of my last lectures. So I'm not going to detail the works of Rachel Carson's further. I just want to quote from the works of Carson that what she says was the most alarming of all man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, rivers and sea with dangerous and even lethal materials. So for the first time in the history of the world, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. So therefore, we might not necessarily or directly encounter, but through the uses of these chemicals or fertilizers, through these food chains, we have become part and parcel or at the receiving end. Now, how does this modern environmentalism differs from what we have just discussed, that is conservation and preservation in the first so-called era? Now, the two salient features which can be outlined here is that the first era, that is during the the conservationist and preservationist era, emphasizes the protection or efficient management of the natural environment, and the primary policy of the modern environmentalism rather is based on the cleanup and control of pollution. So it gave a strong emphasis on the problems which are being encountered and then how to do away with it. And modern environmentalism again transformed from the top-down control by the technical and the managerial leaders into a bottom-up grassroots demands from citizens and citizens groups. So in some sense we can say that it is a grassroots environmentalism. So modern environmentalism emerges from a much more the bottom-up approach. Now we can further for to make us to be aware about or to revive ourselves some of the Rachel Carson's contributions after her publications of the work, that is Silent Spring in 1962. It marked the beginning of modern environmentalism, and Carson was also given this particular title, it is the godmother of modern environmentalism, and then which have in some sense led to the rising awareness or impacted the American public consciousness with her detailed expositions of the use of like the DDT, that is the dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, which is being extensively used. Now in her works, she sort of like examined the ecological impacts of hazardous substances that pollute both the natural and the human environment, that is the use of pesticides, and Carson's alter the way in which how the Americans, and for that matter in other parts of the country or across the world, that how they perceive the environment and the dangers of toxins to themselves, right? Now Carson actually argued that science and technology had been effectively removed from any larger policy framework and insulated from the public input and opinion. Now, as we had sort of like differentiate or outlined the post-1960s with the pre-1960s. So, the environmental movement differs markedly from other American social movement because it was settled from its inception with the notion of these conservative traditions, because some activists were initially cautious about the association of environmentalism with population control and urban elitism. Now, the environmental movement in the post 1960s or from 1960s on was precipitated by two major social changes in the American culture. That is, firstly, citizens or the Americans began searching for improved standard of living and amenities, which are again beyond the necessities and conveniences due to increased personal and social or the real income. So the rising standards of living allow Americans to view nature as an essential provider of recreational activities. And secondly, the increasing levels of education have actually spawned values which are associated with personal creativity and self-development, including involvement with the natural environment. So both of these societal changes allow the individuals to think broadly, that is about the natural habitat in which they live, work and play. So by the period of the late 1960s, the activists began to link the destruction of the natural environment to the complex interplay of new technology, industry, political power and economic power. So therefore, the grassroots community groups which arose to support the family and community autonomy against the powerful institutional forces of corporate industry and the government bureaucracy. Now, one can also perhaps look at the way in which how nature is being tamed in terms of in the pre-1960s period to set up the national parks, and as we had pointed out that many of those ideas are more or less top-down approach. Now, the third era, if you looked at, which sort of led to the emergence of the mainstreamed environmentalism. Now, where I quote from Dennis Hayes, where it is written that our country is stealing from poor nations and from generations which are yet unborn, and we are tired of being told that we are to blame for corporate depredations. Institutions have no conscience. If you want them to do what is right, we must make them to do what is right. So this is one of the opening line which perhaps tries to explain the very idea of how this mainstreamed environmentalism emerges. Now, the Earth Day, which was celebrated or which was held way back in 1970s, was again one of the celebrated and one of the main epoch making in the history of the environmental movement. Now, Earth Day 1970, if you look at, is widely appreciated and hailed as the beginning of the third era of American environmentalism, and which directly led to the emergence of the infusion of social values, of the idea of how for example the into environmentalism. And the Earth Day, this particular event or phenomenon usher in a new political atmosphere, and one reacting against the adverse effects of the, for example, the industrial growth and the kind of pollutions which are being people are being exposed to. For example, the release of the effluents, the way in which how it affected the water bodies and even the soils and so on and so forth. So the 1970s also mark the emergence of new issues regarding toxic chemicals, energy, and the possibilities of social, economic, and political decentralization, as we had point out, that is the bottom-up approach, or maybe the grassroots level of understanding of issues needs to be given emphasis. Now, the Earth Day 1970s is also primarily important because it led to the framing of different laws and policies by the government agencies. Now, with the one peculiar such laws which are being passed is the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, and which eventually led to the framing of a variety of environmental laws and policies, and which of course is being mainstream. Now, the fourth era that is which led to the again the grassroots environmentalism. Now, the environmental movement, if you look at the works of John Cook in his environmental careers organization, now environmental movement has not been practicing one of the laws of nature, that is strength in diversity. Now, why is it that grassroots environmentalism has gained so much importance and gained strength or been given emphasis? Now, grassroots environmentalism embraces the principles of ecological democracy, okay, and is distinguished from the mainstream environmentalism by its belief in citizen participation in environmental decision making. Now, remember how the citizens' participation is important in environmental decision making. So, we will be questioning or interrogating such kind of how people are being the stakeholders, or are they part of the decision making. So, we will be dealing with this kind of questions or issues in a later part of the course, when we looked at, for example, the development paradigms which are being taken up, for example, in building dams, or maybe in mining, or in any form of development activities which are being carried forward. Now, grassroots environmentalism, the basic thrust of this is the participations of people in decision making. Now, perceiving mainstream environmental organizations as too accommodating to both industry and government, and grassroots groups utilize the community right to know laws, citizen enforcement provisions in the federal and state legislation, and local input in waste cleanup methodology and sitting decisions. So, one can perhaps see the underlying principles of how and why grassroots environmentalism is important, and what are the kind of is emphasized. So, as I had pointed out that one of the main important things which perhaps we need to look at is the emergence of, for example, the modern environmental consciousness, that is how social activism began way back from, like the 1950s, and for example, the emergence of, like, for example, the Sharia Club. Now, also there are environmentally concerned groups such as the Environmental Defense Funds, or maybe Friends of the Earth, and environmental action, which began calling up, the government to, for example, stop the industry from polluting the nation's river streams and even coastline. Or maybe it is also important to look at how the emergence of, post 1960s and 70s, and one can also see the way in which how the government respond to it. For example, the 1970s again saw people becoming, concerned that the planet could indeed be rendered uninhabitable, or maybe and in such a case, the government passed laws governing the usage of, for example, air and water, and then which also stressed that these were not free dumping grounds for the country's pollutants. So in such a case, the Clean Air Act of 1970, or maybe the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972, and then which was later called as the Clean Water Act, and its amendments sort of identified causes of land and sought remedies for all categories of water pollution. Now, as I said, there is an increasing public awareness in terms of how there are initiatives which are being encouraged, and people are more actively engaging in to pursue environmental concerns, and people are actively engaging in a kind of how we should actively participate in trying to contribute from our individual capacity, right? So we have in some sense tried to cover up the various stages or era of how environmental movement have emerged, and there are also no doubt several critiques about how this environmental movement should be located, and one can also see that one also needs to move away from this notion of American environmentalism, and then also look beyond America and across the world, how, for example, the Greenpeace movement and so forth are taking place. So to some extent we are more or less being informed by how this environmentalism of the North, or how the idea of wilderness thinking emerges, and which actually paved the way for the emergence of, for example, the national parks, why it is being established, and why it is being racist in nature, because and why there is a lot of hierarchy and stratification, because these national parks again are limited and confined to only those few urban elite, wherein many of those the middle class or those workers are being alienated from the uses of those amenities. So therefore one have also to look critically looked at the way in which how there is a kind of injustice which is being meted out to them. So therefore, and even the priorities, for example, for that matter, that is in the Northern Environmentalism, what it focuses on, and so to critically look into that further, we will be continuing with our classes and a lecture on the global environmentalism, or the how it is taking shape in the global south, and what kind of environmental awareness or consciousness is important in the south, and how the idea of environmentalism or awareness is being prioritized in the south. So we will sort of like engage with trying to compare between the idea of environmental movement or environmentalism in the global north and south, and then look into some of the works of the ecologists and environmentalists, how they make sense of environmental movement in the global south. Thank you.